You think you can trust me to teach you, he said. You think I will keep you safe. But that is the worst sort of foolishness. Whose rooms are these? I repeated numbly. He showed me all his teeth in a sudden grin. Master Hem's. Why are you burning all of Master Hem's clothes? I asked, trying to ignore the fact that the room was rapidly filling with bitter smoke. Elodin looked at me as if I were an idiot. Because I hate him. He picked up the crystal decanter from the mantel and threw it violently against the back of the fireplace where it shattered. The fire began to burn more vigorously from whatever had been left inside. The man is an absolute tit. Nobody talks to me like that. Smoke continued to boil into the room. If it weren't for the high ceilings, we'd already be choking on it. Even so, it was becoming hard to breathe as we made our way to the door. Elodin opened it, and smoke rolled out into the hallway. We stood outside the door, staring at each other, while the smoke billowed past. I decided to take a different tack on the problem. I understand your hesitation, Master Elodin, I said. Sometimes I don't think things all the way through. Obviously. And I'll admit there have been times when my actions have been... I paused, trying to think of something more humble than ill-considered. Stupid beyond all mortal ken? Elodin said helpfully. My temper flared, burning away my brief attempt at humility. Well, thank God I'm the only one here that's ever made a bad decision in my life, I said, barely keeping my voice this side of a shout. I looked him hard in the eye. I've heard stories about you too, you know. They say you toughed things up pretty well yourself back when you were a student here. Elodin's amused expression faded a bit, leaving him looking like he'd swallowed something, and it had gotten stuck halfway down. I continued. If you think I'm reckless, do something about it. Show me the straighter path. Mold my supple young mind. I sucked in a lungful of smoke and began to cough, forcing me to cut my tirade short. Do something, damn you! I choked out. Teach me! I hadn't really been shouting, but I ended up breathless all the same. My temper faded as quickly as it had flared up, and I worried I'd gone too far. But Elodin just looked at me. What makes you think I'm not teaching you? He asked, puzzled. Aside from the fact that you refuse to learn. Then he turned and walked down the hallway. I'd get out of here if I were you, he said over his shoulder. People are going to want to know who's responsible for this, and everyone knows you and Hem don't get on very well. I felt myself break into a panicked sweat. What? I'd wash up before admissions, too, he said. It won't look good if you show up reeking of smoke. I live here, Elodin said, pulling a key from his pocket and unlocking a door at the far end of the hallway. What's your excuse? Chapter 9. A Civil Tongue. My hair was still wet when I made my way through a short hallway, then up the stairs onto the stage of an empty theater. As always, the room was dark except for the huge crescent-shaped table. I moved to the edge of the light and waited politely. The Chancellor motioned me forward, and I walked to the center of the table, reaching up to hand him my tile. Then, I stepped back to stand in the circle of slightly brighter light between the two outthrust horns of the table. The 9 masters looked down at me. I'd like to say they looked dramatic, like ravens on a fence or something like that. But while they were all wearing their formal robes, they were too mismatched to look like a collection of anything. What's more, I could see the marks of weariness on them. Only then did it occur to me that as much as the students hated admissions, it was probably no walk in the garden for the masters either. Quoth Arladin's son, the Chancellor said formally. Relar. He made a gesture to the far right-hand horn of the table. Master Visiker? Arwyl peered down at me, his face grandfatherly behind his round spectacles. What are the medicinal properties of Menka? He asked. Powerful anesthetic, I said. Powerful catatoniate. Potential purgative. I hesitated. It has a whole sack full of complicating secondaries, too. Should I list them all? Arwyl shook his head. A patient comes into the Medica complaining of pains in their joints and difficulty breathing. Their mouth is dry, and they claim to have a sweet taste in their mouth. They complain of chills, but they are actually sweaty and feverish. What is your diagnosis? I drew a breath, then hesitated. I don't make diagnoses in the Medica, Master Arwell. I'd fetch one of your Alpha to do it. He smiled at me, eyes crinkling around the edges. Correct, he said. But for the sake of argument, what do you think might be wrong? Is the patient a student? Arwell raised an eyebrow. What does that have to do with the price of butter? If they work in the fishery, it might be smelter's flu, I said. Arwell cocked an eyebrow at me, and I added, There's all sorts of heavy metal poisoning you can get in the fishery. It's rare around here because the students are well trained, but anyone working with hot bronze can inhale enough fumes to kill themselves if they aren't properly careful. I saw Kilvin nodding along, and I was glad I didn't have to admit the only reason I knew this was that I'd given myself a mild case of it a month ago. Arwell gave a thoughtful then gestured to the other side of the table. Master arithmetician? Brander sat on the left-hand point of the table. Assuming the changer takes 4%, how many pennies can you break from a talent? He asked the question without looking up from the papers in front of him. What type of penny, Master Brander? He looked up, frowning. We're still in the Commonwealth, if I remember correctly. I juggled numbers in my head, working from the figures in the books he'd set aside in the archives. They weren't the true exchange rates you would get from a moneylender. They were the official exchange rates governments and financiers used so they had common ground for lying to each other. In iron pennies, 350, I said, then added, 1.5. Brander looked down at the papers before I'd even finished speaking. Your compass reads gold at 220 points, platinum at 112 points, and cobalt at 32 points. Where are you? I was boggled by the question. Orienting by trifoil required detailed maps and painstaking triangulation. It was usually only practiced by sea captains and cartographers, and they used detailed charts to make their calculations. I'd only ever laid eyes on a trifoil compass twice in my life. Either this was a question listed in one of the books Brander had set aside for study, or it was deliberately designed to spike my wheel. Given that Brander and Hem were friends, I guessed it was the latter. I closed my eyes, brought up a map of the civilized world in my head, and took my best guess. Tarbean? I said. Maybe somewhere in Yil? I opened my eyes. Honestly, I have no idea. Brander made a mark on a piece of paper. Master Namer, he said without looking up. Elodin gave me a wicked, knowing grin, and I was suddenly struck with the fear that he might reveal my part of what we had done in Hem's rooms earlier that morning. Instead, he held up 3 fingers dramatically. You have 3 spades in your hand, he said, and there have been 5 spades played. He steepled his fingers and looked at me seriously. How many spades is that? 8 spades, I said. The other masters stirred slightly in their seats. Arwell sighed. Kilvin slouched. Hem and Brandur went too far as to roll their eyes at each other. Altogether, they gave the impression of long-suffering exasperation. Elodin scowled at them. What? He demanded, his voice going hard around the edges. You want me to take this song and dance more seriously? You want me to ask him questions only a namer can answer? The other masters stilled at this, looking uncomfortable and refusing to meet his eye. Hem was the exception and glared openly. Fine, Elodin said, turning back to me. His eyes were dark, and his voice had a strange resonance to it. It wasn't loud, but when he spoke, it seemed to fill the entire hall. It left no space left over for any other sound. Where does the moon go? Elodin asked grimly, when it is no longer in our sky. The room seemed unnaturally quiet when he stopped speaking, as if his voice had left a hole in the world. I waited to see if there was more to the question, I haven't the slightest, I admitted. After Elodin's voice, my own seemed rather thin and insubstantial. Elodin shrugged, then gestured graciously across the table. Master sympathist? Elxadal was the only one who really looked comfortable in his formal robes. As always, his dark beard and lean face made me think of the evil magician in so many bad Aturan plays. He gave me a bit of a sympathetic look. How about the binding for linear galvanic attraction? He said in an offhand way. I rattled it off easily. He nodded. What's the distance of insurmountable decay for iron? 5.5 miles, I said, giving the textbook answer despite the fact that I had some quibbles with the term insurmountable. While it was true that moving any significant amount of energy more than 6 miles was statistically impossible, you could still use sympathy to douse over much greater distances. Once an ounce of water is boiling, how much heat will it take to boil it completely away? I dragged up what I could remember from the vaporization tables I'd worked with in the fishery. 180 thoms, I said, with more assurance than I actually felt. Good enough for me, Dahl said. Master alchemist? Mandrag waved a mottled hand dismissively. I'll pass. He's good with questions about spades, Elodin suggested. Mandrag frowned at Elodin. Master Archivist. Loren stared down at me, his long face impassive. What are the rules of the archives? I flushed at this and looked down. Move quietly, I said. Respect the books. Obey the scribs. No water. No food. I swallowed. No fire. Loren nodded. Nothing in his tone or demeanor indicated any sort of disapproval, but that just made it worse. His eyes moved across the table. Master Artificer? I cursed inwardly. Over the last span, I'd read all 6 books Master Loren had set aside for Relar to study from. Feltami Rice's Fall of Empire alone took me 10 hours. I wanted few things more than access to the archives, and I desperately hoped to impress Master Loren by answering whatever question he could think to ask. But there was no help for it. I turned to face Kilvin. Galvanic throughput of copper! The great bear-like master rumbled through his beard. I gave it to 5 places. I'd had to use it while making calculations for the deck lamps. Conductive coefficient of gallium. I needed to know that to dope the emitters for the lamps. Was Kilvin lobbing me easy questions? I gave the answer. Good, Kilvin said. Master rhetorician. I drew a deep breath as I turned to look at Hem. I had gone so far as to read 3 of his books, though I have a sharp loathing for rhetoric and pointless philosophy. Still, I could tamp down my distaste for 2 minutes' time and play the part of a good, humble student. I am one of the Rue. I could act the part. Hem scowled at me, his round face like an angry moon. Did you set fire to my rooms, you little Ravel bastard? The raw nature of the question caught me entirely off my guard. I was ready for impossibly hard questions, or trick questions, or questions he could twist to make any answer I gave seem wrong. But this sudden accusation caught me utterly wrong-footed. Ravel is a term I particularly despise. A welter of emotion rolled through me and brought the sudden taste of plum to my mouth. While part of me was still considering the most gracious way to respond, I found I was already speaking. I didn't set fire to your rooms, I said honestly, but I wish I had. And I wish you'd been in there when it started, sleeping soundly. Hem's expression turned from scowling to astonished. Relar quoth! The Chancellor snapped. You will keep a civil tongue in your head, or I will bring you up on charges of conduct unbecoming myself. The taste of plum disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving me feeling slightly dizzy and sweating with fear and embarrassment. My apologies, Chancellor, I said quickly, looking down at my feet. I spoke in anger. Ravel is a term my people find particularly offensive. Its use makes light of the systematic slaughter of thousands of Rue. A curious line appeared between the Chancellor's eyebrows. I'll admit I don't know that particular etymology, he mused. I guess I'll make that my question. Hold off, Hem interrupted. I'm not finished. You are finished, the Chancellor said, his voice hard and firm. You're as bad as the boy, Jason, and with less excuse. You've shown you can't conduct yourself in a professional manner, so stint thy clep and consider yourself lucky I don't call for an official censure. Hem went white with anger, but he held his tongue. The Chancellor turned to look at me. Master Linguist, he announced himself formally. Relakvoth? What is the etymology of the word ravel? It comes from the purges instigated by Emperor Alcyon, I said. He issued a proclamation saying any of the traveling rabble on the roads were subject to fines, imprisonment, or transportation without trial. The term became shortened to ravel through metaplasmic enclitization. He raised an eyebrow at that. Did it now? I nodded, though I also expect there is a connection to the term ravel end, referring to the ragged appearance of performing troops that are out at the heels. The Chancellor nodded formally. Thank you, Relakvoth. Take a seat while we confer. Chapter 10. Being Treasured. My tuition was set at 9 talents and 5, better than the 10 talents Manette had predicted, but more than I had in my purse. I had until tomorrow noon to settle up with the bursar, or I would be forced to miss an entire term. Having to postpone my studies wouldn't have been a tragedy, but only students are allowed access to university resources such as the equipment in the artificery. That meant if I couldn't pay my tuition, I would be barred from my work in Kilvin's shop, the only job where I could hope to earn enough money for my tuition. I stopped at the stocks, and Jackson smiled as I approached the open window. Just sold your lamps this morning, he said. We squeezed them for a little extra because they were the last ones left. He leafed through the ledger until he found the appropriate page. Your 60% comes out to 4 talents and 8 jots, after the materials and piecework you used. He ran his finger down a page. You're left with 2 talents, 3 jots, and 8 drabs. Jackson made a note in the ledger, then wrote me a receipt. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my purse. It didn't have the satisfying weight of coins, but it brought my total up to more than 6 talents. So much money, but still not enough. If I hadn't lost my temper with Hem, my tuition might have been low enough. I could have studied more, or earned more money if I hadn't been forced to hide in my room for almost 2 whole days, weeping and raging with a taste of plum in my mouth. A thought occurred to me. I should start something new, I guess, I said casually. I'll need a small crucible, 3 ounces of tin, 2 ounces of bronze, 4 ounces of silver, a spool of fine gold wire, a copper— Hold on a second, Jackson interrupted me. He ran a finger back along my name in the ledger. I don't have you authorized for gold or silver. He looked up at me. Is that a mistake? I hesitated, not wanting to lie. I didn't know you needed authorization, I said. Jackson gave me a knowing grin. You're not the first one to try something like that, he said. Rough tuition? I nodded. He grimaced sympathetically. Sorry. Kilvin knows stocks could turn into a moneylender's stall if he isn't careful. He closed the ledger. You'll have to hit the pawn shop like everyone else. I held up my hands, showing him the fronts and backs to make a point of my lack of jewelry. Jackson winced. That's rough. I know a decent moneylender on Silver Court only charges 10% a month. It's still like having your teeth pulled, but better than most. I nodded and sighed. Silver Court was where the guild moneylenders had their shops. They wouldn't give me the time of day. It's certainly better than I've gotten in the past, I said. I thought things over while I walked to Imre, the familiar weight of my loot resting on one shoulder. I was in a tight spot, but not a terrible one. No guild moneylender would lend money to an orphan Adimaru with no collateral, but I could borrow the money from Davy. Still, I wish it hadn't come to that. Not only was her rate of interest extortionate, but I worried what favors she might require of me if I ever defaulted my loan. I doubted they would be small, or easy, or entirely legal. Such were the turnings of my thoughts as I made my way over Stonebridge. I stopped by an apothecary, then made my way to the Grey Man. Opening the door, I saw the Grey Man was a boarding house. There was no common room where people could gather and drink. Instead, there was a small, richly appointed parlor, complete with a well-dressed porter who eyed me with an air of disapproval, if not outright distaste. "Can I help you, young sir?" he asked as I came in the door. "I'm calling on a young lady," I said, "by the name of Danail." He nodded. "I shall go and see if she's in." "Don't trouble yourself," I said, moving toward the stairs. "She's expecting me." The man moved to block my way. "I'm afraid that isn't possible," he said, "but I will be glad to see if the lady is in." He held out his hand. I looked at it. "Your calling card?" he asked. "That I might present it to the young lady." "How can you give her my card if you aren't sure she's in?" I asked. The porter gave me the smile again. It was gracious, polite, and so sharply unpleasant that I took special note of it, fixing it in my memory. A smile like that is a work of art. As someone who grew up on the stage, I could appreciate it on several levels. A smile like that is like a knife in certain social settings, and I might have need of it someday. "Ah," the porter said. "The lady is in," he said with a certain emphasis. "But that does not necessarily mean she is in for you." "You can tell her Kvothe has come calling," I said, more amused than offended. "I'll wait." I didn't have to wait long. The porter came down the stairs wearing an irritated expression, as if he'd been looking forward to throwing me out. "This way," he said. I followed him upstairs. He opened a door, and I swept past him with what I hoped was an irritating amount of dismissive aplomb. It was a sitting room with wide windows that let in the late afternoon sun, large enough to seem spacious despite the scattered chairs and couches. A hammer dulcimer sat against the far wall, and one corner of the room was entirely occupied by a massive Modegan great harp. Denna stood in the center of the room wearing a green velvet dress. Her hair was arranged to display her elegant neck to good effect, revealing the emerald teardrop earrings and matching necklace at her throat. She was talking to a young man who was... the best word I can think of is pretty. He had a sweet, clean-shaven face with wide, dark eyes. He had the look of a young noble who had been down on his luck too long for it to be a temporary thing. His clothing was fine but rumpled. His dark hair was cut in a style obviously meant to be curled, but it hadn't been tended to recently. His eyes were sunken, as if he hadn't been sleeping well. Denna held out her hands to me. "Kvothe," she said, "come meet Geoffrey." "Pleasure to meet you, Kvothe," Geoffrey said. "Danail has told me quite a bit about you. You're a bit of a... what is it? Wizard?" His smile was open and utterly guileless. "Arcanist, actually," I said as politely as possible. "Wizard brings too much storybook nonsense to mind. People expect us to wear dark robes and fling about the entrails of birds. And yourself?" "Geoffrey is a poet," Denna said. "And a good one, though he'll deny it." "I will," he admitted. Then his smile faded. "I have to go. I have an appointment with folk who shouldn't be kept waiting." He gave Denna a kiss on the cheek, shook my hand warmly, and left. Denna watched the door close behind him. "He's a sweet boy." "You say that as if you regret it," I said. "If he were a little less sweet, He might be able to fit two thoughts in his head at the same time. Maybe they would rub together and make a spark. Even a little smoke would be nice. Then at least it would look like something was happening in there. She sighed. Is he really that thick? She shook her head. No. He's just trusting. Hasn't got a calculating bone in his body, and he's done nothing but make bad choices since he got here a month ago. I reached into my cloak and brought out a pair of small cloth-wrapped bundles. One blue, one white. I've brought you a present. Denna reached out to take them, looking slightly puzzled. What had seemed like such a good idea a few hours ago now seemed rather foolish. They're for your lungs, I said, suddenly embarrassed. I know you have trouble sometimes. She tilted her head on one side. And how do you know that, pray tell? You mentioned it when we were in Traben, I said. I did some research. I pointed. That one you can brew in tea. Featherbite, dead nettle, lohadum. I pointed to the other. That one, you boil the leaves in some water and breathe the vapor coming off the top. Denna looked back and forth between the packages. I've written instructions on slips of paper inside, I said. The blue one is the one you're supposed to boil and breathe the vapor, I said. Blue for water, you see? She looked up at me. Don't you make a tea with water too? I blinked at that, then flushed and started to say something, but Denna laughed and shook her head. I'm teasing you, she said gently. Thank you. This is the sweetest thing that anyone's done for me in a long while. Denna walked over to a chest of drawers and tucked the two bundles carefully into an ornate wooden box. You seem to be doing fairly well for yourself, I said, gesturing to the well-appointed room. Denna shrugged, looking around the room indifferently. Kellen is doing well for himself, she said. I merely stand in his reflected light. I nodded my understanding. I thought perhaps you'd found yourself a patron. Nothing so formal as that. Kellen and I are walking about together, as they say in Modeg, and he is showing me my way around the harp. She nodded to where the instrument loomed hugely in the corner. Care to show me what you've learned? I asked. Denna shook her head, embarrassed. Her hair slid down around her shoulders as she did so. I'm not very good yet. I will restrain my natural urge to jeer and hiss, I said graciously. Denna laughed. Fine, just a bit. She walked behind the harp and drew up a tall stool to lean against. Then she lifted her hands to the strings, paused for a long moment, and began to play. The melody was a variant of Bellwether. I smiled. Her playing was slow, almost stately. Too many people think speed is the hallmark of a good musician. It's understandable. What Marie had done at the Aeolian was amazing. But how quickly you can finger notes is the smallest part of music. The real key is timing. It's like telling a joke. Anyone can remember the words. Anyone can repeat it. But making someone laugh requires more than that. Telling a joke faster doesn't make it funnier. As with many things, hesitation is better than hurry. This is why there are so few true musicians. A lot of folks can sing or saw out a tune on a fiddle. A music box can play a song flawlessly again and again. But knowing the notes isn't enough. You have to know how to play them. Speed comes with time and practice, but timing you are born with. You have it or you don't. Denna had it. She moved slowly through the song, but she wasn't plodding. She played it slow as a luxurious kiss. Not that I knew anything of kissing at that point in my life, but as she stood with her arms around the harp, her eyes half-lidded with concentration, her lips slightly pursed, I knew I someday wanted to be kissed with that amount of slow, deliberate care. And she was beautiful. I suppose it should come as no surprise that I have a particular fondness for women with music running through them. But as she played, I saw her for the first time that day. Before, I had been distracted by the difference in her hair, the cut of her dress. But as she played, all that faded from view. I ramble. Suffice to say, she was impressive, though obviously still learning. She struck a few bad notes, but didn't flinch or cringe away from them. As they say, a jeweler knows the uncut gem. And I am. And she was. And so, you're a long way past Squirrel in the Thatch, I said quietly after she'd struck the final notes. She shrugged my compliment away, not meeting my eye. I don't have much to do but practice, she said. And Kellen says I have a bit of a knack. How long have you been at it? I asked. 3 span? She looked thoughtful, then nodded. A little less than 3 span. Mother of God, I said, shaking my head. Don't ever tell anyone how quickly you've picked it up. Other musicians will hate you for it. My fingers aren't used to it yet, she said, looking down at them. I can't practice nearly as long as I like. I reached out and took hold of one of her hands, turning it palm up so I could see her fingertips. There were fading blisters there. I looked up and realized how close she was standing. Her hand was cool in mine. She stared at me with huge, dark eyes, one eyebrow slightly raised, not arch or playful even, just gently curious. My stomach felt suddenly strange and weak. I've what? She asked. I realized I had no idea what I had been about to say. I thought of saying, I have no idea what I was going to say. Then I realized that would be a stupid thing to say. So I didn't say anything. Denna looked down and took hold of my hand, turning it over. Your hands are soft, she said, then touched my fingertips lightly. I thought the calluses would be rough, but they're not. They're smooth. Once her eyes weren't fixed on mine, I regained a small piece of my wits. It just takes time, I said. Denna looked up and gave a shy smile. My mind went blank as fresh paper. After a moment, Denna let go of my hand and moved past me to the center of the room. Would you care for something to drink? She asked as she settled gracefully into a chair. That would be very kind of you, I said purely on reflex. I realized my hand was still hanging stupidly in midair, and I let it fall to my side. She gestured to a nearby chair, and I sat. Watch this. She picked up a small silver bell from a nearby table and rang it softly. Then she held up one hand with all 5 fingers extended. She folded in her thumb, then her index finger, counting downward. Before she folded in her smallest finger, there came a knock on the door. Come in, Denna called, and the well-dressed porter opened the door. I believe I would like some drinking chocolate, she said. And quoth? She looked at me questioningly. Drinking chocolate sounds lovely, I said. The porter nodded and disappeared, closing the door behind him. Sometimes I do it just to make him run, Denna admitted sheepishly, looking down at the bell. I can't imagine how he can hear it. For a while, I was convinced he was sitting in the hallway with his ear against my door. Can I see the bell? I asked. She handed it over. It looked normal at first glance, but when I turned it upside down, I saw some tiny sigildry on the inner surface of the bell. He isn't eavesdropping, I said, handing it back. There's another bell downstairs that rings in time with this one. How? She asked, then answered her own question. Magic? You could call it that. Is that the sort of thing you do over there? She jerked her head in the direction of the river and the university beyond. It seems a little tawdry. It's the most frivolous use of sigildry I've ever seen, I said. Denna burst out laughing. You sound so offended, she said. Then, it's called sigildry? Making something like that is called artificing, I said. Sigildry is writing or carving the runes that make it work. Denna's eyes lit up at this. So, it's a magic where you write things down? She asked, leaning forward in her chair. How does it work? I hesitated, not only because it was a huge question, but because the university has very specific rules about sharing Arcanum secrets. It's rather complicated, I said. Luckily, at that moment, there was another knock on the door, and our chocolate arrived in steaming cups. My mouth watered at the smell of it. The man set the tray on a nearby table and left without a word. I sipped and smiled at the thick sweetness of it. It's been years since I've had chocolate, I said. Denna lifted her cup and looked around the room. It's strange to think some people live their whole lives like this, she mused. It's not to your liking? I asked, surprised. I like the chocolate and the harp, she said, but I could do without the bell and a whole room just for sitting. Her mouth curved into the beginning of a frown. And I hate knowing someone is set to guard me, like I'm a treasure someone might try to steal. You're not to be treasured, then? She narrowed her eyes over the top of her cup, as if she wasn't sure how serious I was. I don't fancy being under lock and key, she clarified with a grim note in her voice. I don't mind being given rooms, but they aren't really mine if I'm not free to come and go. I raised an eyebrow at that, but before I could say anything, she waved her hand dismissively. It's not like that, really, she sighed. But I don't doubt Kellen is informed of my comings and goings. I know the porter tells him who comes calling. It rankles a bit is all. She gave a crooked smile. I suppose that seems terribly ungrateful, doesn't it? Not at all, I said. When I was younger, my troupe traveled everywhere, but every year we would spend a few span at our patron's estate, performing for his family and his guests. I shook my head at the memory. Baron Greyfallow was a gracious host. We sat at his own table. He gave us gifts. I trailed off, remembering a regiment of tiny lead soldiers he'd given me. I shook my head clear of the thought. But my father hated it. Climbed the walls. He couldn't tolerate the feeling of being at someone's beck and call. Yes, Denna said. That's exactly it. If Kellen says he might pay me a visit on such and such evening, suddenly I feel I've had one foot nailed to the floor. If I leave, I'm being obstinate and rude. But if I stay, I feel like a dog waiting by the door. We sat for a moment in silence. Denna twirled the ring on her finger absent-mindedly, sunlight catching the pale blue stone. Still, I said, looking around, they are nice rooms. They're nice when you're here, she said. Several hours later, I climbed a narrow flight of stairs behind a butcher's shop. There was a faint, pervasive smell of rancid fat from the alley below, but I was smiling. An afternoon with Denna entirely to myself was a rare treat, and my step was surprisingly light for someone about to make a deal with a demon. I knocked on the solid wooden door at the top of the steps and waited. No guild moneylender would trust me with a bent penny, but there are always folk willing to lend money. Poets and other romantics call them copperhawks or sharps, but Gaelet is a better term. They are dangerous people, and wise folks steer well clear of them. The door opened a crack, then swung wide, revealing a young woman with a pixie face and strawberry blonde hair. "Quoth!" Davy exclaimed. "I worried I might not see you this term." I stepped inside, and Davy bolted the door behind me. The large, windowless room smelled pleasantly of cinnus fruit and honey, a refreshing change from the alley. One side of the room was dominated by a huge canopy bed, its dark curtains drawn. On the other side was a fireplace, a large wooden desk, and a standing bookshelf 3/4 full. I wandered over to eye the titles while Davy locked and barred the door. "Is this copy of Malkath new?" I asked. "It is," she said, walking over to stand beside me. "A young alchemist who couldn't settle his debt let me pick through his library in order to square things between us." Davy carefully pulled the book from the shelf, revealing Vision and Revision in gold leaf on the cover. She looked up at me, grinning impishly. Have you read it? I haven't, I said. I'd wanted to study it for admissions, but hadn't been able to find a copy in the stacks. Just heard about it. Davy looked thoughtful for a moment, then handed it to me. When you've finished, come back and we'll discuss it. I'm woefully devoid of interesting conversation these days. If we have a decent argument, I might let you borrow another. Once the book was in my hands, she tapped the cover lightly with a finger. This book is worth more than you are, she said without a hint of playfulness in her voice. If it comes back damaged, there will be an accounting. I'll be very careful, I said. Davy nodded, then turned and walked past me toward the desk. Right then, on to business. She sat down. Cutting it a little close, aren't you? She asked. Tuition needs to be paid before noon tomorrow. I live a dangerous and exciting life, I said as I wandered over and took a seat across from her. And delightful as I find your company, I was hoping to avoid your services this turn. How do you like tuition as a Relar? She asked knowingly. How hard did they hit you? That's a rather personal question, I said. Davy gave me a frank look. We're about to enter into a rather personal arrangement, she pointed out. I hardly feel I'm overstepping myself. 9.5, I said. She snorted derisively. I thought you were supposed to be all manner of clever. I never got higher than 7 when I was a Relar. You had access to the archives, I pointed out. I had access to vast stores of intellect, she said matter-of-factly. Plus, I'm cute as a button. She gave a grin that brought out dimples in both her cheeks. You are shiny as a new penny, I admitted. No man can hope to stand against you. Some women have trouble keeping their feet as well, she said. Her grin changed slightly, moving from adorable to impish, and then well past the border into wicked. Not having the slightest idea how to respond to that, I moved in a safer direction. I'm afraid I need to borrow 4 talents, I said. Ah, Davy said. Suddenly businesslike, she folded her hands atop the desk. I'm afraid I've made a few changes to my business recently, she said. Currently, I am only extending loans of 6 talents or more. I didn't bother trying to hide my dismay. 6 talents? Davy, that extra debt will be a millstone around my neck. She gave a sigh that sounded at least slightly apologetic. Here's the trouble. When I make a loan, I run certain risks. I risk losing my investment if my debtor dies or tries to run. I run the risk they'll attempt to report me. I run the risk of being brought up against the iron law, or worse, the Moneylenders Guild. You know I'd never try something like that, Davy. The fact remains, Davy continued. My risk is the same, no matter if the loan is small or large. Why should I take those risks for small loans? Small? I asked. I could live for a year on 4 talents. She tapped the desk with a finger, pursing her mouth. Collateral? The usual, I said, giving her my best smile. My boundless charm? Davy snorted indelicately. For boundless charm and 3 drops of blood, you can borrow 6 talents at my standard rate. 50% interest over a 2-month term. Davy, I said ingratiatingly. What am I going to do with the extra money? Throw a party, she suggested. Spend a day in the buckle. Find yourself a nice game of high-stakes faro. Faro, I said, is a tax on people who can't calculate probabilities. Then run bank and collect the tax, she said. Buy yourself something pretty and wear it next time you come in to see me. She looked me up and down with dangerous eyes. Maybe then I'll be willing to cut you a deal. How about 6 talents for a month at 25%? I asked. Davy shook her head, not unkindly. Quoth, I respect the impulse to bargain, but you don't have any leverage. You're here because you're over a barrel. I'm here to capitalize on that situation. She spread her hands in a helpless gesture. That's how I make my living. The fact that you have a sweet face doesn't really enter into it. Davy gave me a serious look. Conversely, if a guild moneylender would give you the time of day, I wouldn't expect you to come here simply because I'm pretty and you like the color of my hair. It is a lovely color, I said. We fiery types should really stick together. We should, she agreed. I propose we stick together at 50% interest over a 2-month term. Fine, I said, slumping back into my chair. You win. Davy gave me a winsome smile, dimples showing again. I can only win if we were both actually playing. She opened a drawer in the desk, bringing out a small glass bottle and a long pin. I reached out to take them, but instead of sliding them across the desk, she gave me a thoughtful look. Now that I think of it, there might be another option. I'd love another option, I admitted. The last time we talked, Davy said slowly, you implied you head away into the archives. I hesitated. I did imply that. That information would be worth quite a bit to me, she said over-casually. Though she tried to hide it, I could see a fierce, lean hunger in her eyes. I looked down at my hands and didn't say anything. I'll give you 10 talents right now, Davy said bluntly. Not alone. I'll buy the information outright. If I get caught in the stacks, I never learned it from you. I thought of everything I could do with 10 talents. New clothes, a loot case that wasn't about to fall to pieces, paper, gloves for the coming winter. I sighed and shook my head. 20 talents, Davy said, and guild rates on any loans you want in the future. 20 talents would mean half a year of worry-free tuition. I could pursue my own projects in the fishery rather than slaving away at deck lamps. I could buy tailored clothes, fresh fruit. I could use a laundry rather than wash my clothes myself. I drew a reluctant breath. 40 talents, Davy said hungrily. Guild rates, and I will take you to bed. For 40 talents, I could buy Denna her own half-harp. I looked up and saw Davy staring at me from across the desk. Her lips were wet, her pale blue eyes intense. She shifted her shoulders back and forth in the slow, unconscious motion of a cat before it pounces. I thought of Ari, safe and happy in the Underthing. What would she do if her tiny kingdom was invaded by a stranger? I'm sorry, I said. I can't. Getting in is complicated. It involves a friend, and I don't think they'd be willing. I decided to ignore the other part of her offer, as I hadn't the slightest idea what to say about it. There was a long, tense moment. God damn you, Davy said at last. You sound like you're telling the truth. I am, I said. It's unsettling. I know. God damn. She scowled as she pushed the bottle and pin across the desk. I pricked the back of my hand and watched the blood well up and roll down my hand to fall into the bottle. After 3 drops, I tipped the pin into the mouth of the bottle as well. Davy swabbed some adhesive around the stopper and drove it angrily into the bottle. Then she reached into a drawer and pulled out a diamond stylus. Do you trust me? She asked as she etched a number into the glass. Or do you want this sealed? I trust you, I said, but I'd like it sealed all the same. She melted a daub of sealing wax onto the top of the bottle. I pressed my talent pipes into it, leaving a recognizable impression. Reaching into another drawer, Davy brought out 6 talents and clattered them onto the desk. The motion might have seemed petulant if her eyes hadn't been so hard and angry. I'm getting in there one way or another, she said with a chill edge to her voice. Talk to your friend. If you're the one that helps me, I'll make it worth your time. Chapter 11. Haven. I returned to the university in good spirits, despite the burden of my new debt. I made a few purchases, gathered up my loot, and headed out over the rooftops. From the inside, Mainz was a nightmare to navigate. a maze of irrational hallways and stairways leading nowhere. But moving across its jumbled rooftops was easy as anything. I made my way to a small courtyard that at some point in the building's construction had become completely inaccessible, trapped like a fly in amber. Ari wasn't expecting me, but this was the first place I'd met her, and on clear nights she sometimes came out to watch the stars. I checked to make sure the classrooms overlooking the courtyard were dark and empty. Then I brought out my lute and began to tune it. I'd been playing for almost an hour when I heard a rustling movement in the overgrown courtyard below. Then Ari appeared, scurrying up the overgrown apple tree and onto the roof. She ran toward me, her bare feet skipping lightly across the tar, her hair blowing behind her. "I heard you," she said as she came close. "I heard you all the way down in vaults." "I seem to remember," I said slowly, "that I was going to play music for someone." "Me!" She held both her hands close to her chest, grinning. She moved from foot to foot, almost dancing with her eagerness. "Play for me! I've been as patient as 2 stones together," she said. "You are just in time. I could not be as patient as 3 stones." "Well," I said hesitantly, "I suppose it all depends on what you've brought me." She laughed, rising up onto the balls of her feet, her hands still together, close to her chest. "What did you bring me?" I knelt and began to untie my bundle. "I've brought you 3 things," I said. "How traditional," she said, grinning. "You are quite the proper young gentleman tonight." "I am." I held up a heavy, dark bottle. She took it with both hands. "Who made it?" "Bees," I said. "And brewers in Bredon." Ari smiled. "That's 3 bees," she said, and set the bottle down by her feet. I brought out a round loaf of fresh barley bread. She reached out and touched it with a finger, then nodded approvingly. Last, I brought out a whole smoked salmon. It had cost 4 drabs by itself, but I worried Ari didn't get enough meat in whatever she managed to scrounge up when I wasn't around. It would be good for her. Ari looked down at it curiously, tilting her head to look into its single staring eye. "Hello, fish," she said. Then she looked back up at me. "Does it have a secret?" I nodded. "It has a harp instead of a heart." She looked back down at it. No wonder it looked so surprised. Ari took the fish out of my hands and laid it carefully on the roof. "Now, stand up. I have 3 things for you, as is only fair." I came to my feet and she held out something wrapped in a piece of cloth. It was a thick candle that smelled of lavender. "What's inside of it?" I asked. "Happy dreams," she said. "I put them there for you." I turned the candle over in my hands, a suspicion forming. "Did you make this yourself?" She nodded and gave a delighted grin. "I did. I am terribly clever." I tucked it carefully into one of the pockets of my cloak. "Thank you, Ari." Ari grew serious. "Now close your eyes and bend down so I can give you your second present." Puzzled, I closed my eyes and bent at the waist, wondering if she had made me a hat as well. I felt her hands on either side of my face. Then she gave me a tiny, delicate kiss in the middle of my forehead. Surprised, I opened my eyes, but she was already standing several steps away, her hands clasped nervously behind her back. I couldn't think of anything to say. Ari took a step forward. "You are special to me," she said seriously, her face grave. "I want you to know I will always take care of you." She reached out tentatively and wiped at my cheeks. "No, none of that tonight. This is your 3rd present. If things are bad, you can come and stay with me in the underthing. It's nice there, and you'll be safe." "Thank you, Ari," I said as soon as I was able. "You are special to me, too." "Of course I am," she said matter-of-factly. "I am as lovely as the moon." I collected myself while Ari skipped over to a piece of metal piping that jutted from a chimney and used it to pry the cap off the bottle. Then she brought it back, holding it carefully with both hands. Ari, I asked, aren't your feet cold? She looked down at them. The tar is nice, she said, wriggling her toes. It's still warm from the sun. Would you like a pair of shoes? What would they have in them? She asked. Your feet, I said. It's going to be winter soon. She shrugged. Your feet will be cold. I don't come out on top of things in the winter, she said. It isn't very nice. Before I could respond, Elodin stepped around a large brick chimney as casually as if he were out for an afternoon stroll. The three of us stared at each other for a moment, each of us startled in our own way. Elodin and I were surprised, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ari grow perfectly still, like a deer ready to spring away to safety. Master Elodin, I said in my gentlest, friendliest tones, desperately hoping he wouldn't do anything that might startle Ari into running. The last time she'd been scared back underground, it had taken her a full span to reemerge. How nice to meet you. Hello there, Elodin said, matching my casual tone perfectly, as if there was nothing odd about the three of us meeting on a rooftop in the middle of the night. Though for all I knew, it might not seem odd to him. Master Elodin? Ari dipped one bare foot behind the other and tugged the edges of her ragged dress in a tiny curtsy. Elodin remained in the moon-cast shadow of the tall brick chimney. He made a curiously formal bow in return. I couldn't see his face in any detail, but I could imagine his curious eyes examining the barefoot waifish girl with the nimbus of floating hair. And what brings the two of you out this fine night? Elodin asked. I tensed. Questions were dangerous with Ari. Luckily, this one didn't seem to bother her. Kvothe has brought me lovely things, she said. He brought me bee beer and barley bread, and a smoked fish with a harp where its heart should be. Ah, Elodin said, stepping away from the chimney. He patted his robes until he found something in a pocket. He held it out to her. I'm afraid I've only brought you a sinus fruit. Ari took a tiny dancer step backward and made no motion to take it. Have you brought anything for Kvothe? This seemed to catch Elodin off his stride. He stood awkwardly for a moment, arm outstretched. I'm afraid I haven't, he said. But I don't imagine Kvothe has brought anything for me either. Ari's eyes narrowed, and she gave a tiny frown, fierce with disapproval. Kvothe has brought music, she said sternly, which is for everyone. Elodin paused again, and I have to admit, I enjoyed seeing him discomfited by someone else's behavior for once. He turned and made a half bow in my direction. My apologies, he said. I made a gracious gesture. Think nothing of it. Elodin turned back to Ari and held out his hand a second time. She took 2 small steps forward, hesitated, then took 2 more. She reached out slowly, paused with her hand on the small fruit, then took several scurrying steps away, bringing both hands close to her chest. Thank you kindly, she said, making another small curtsy. Now, you may join us if you like, and if you behave, you may stay and listen to Kvothe play afterward. She tilted her head a bit, making it a question. Elodin hesitated, then nodded. Ari scampered around to the other side of the roof, then down into the courtyard through the bare limbs of the apple tree. Elodin watched her go. When he tilted his head, there was just enough moonlight that I could see a thoughtful expression on his face. I felt a sudden, sharp anxiety tie knots in my stomach. Master Elodin? He turned to face me. I knew from experience it would only take her 3 or 4 minutes to fetch whatever she was bringing up from the underthing. I needed to talk fast. I know this looks strange, I said, but you have to be careful. She's very nervous. Don't try to touch her. Don't make any sudden movements. It will scare her away. Elodin's expression was hidden in shadow again. Will it now? He said. Loud noises too, even a loud laugh. And you can't ask her anything resembling a personal question. She'll just run if you do. I drew a deep breath, my mind racing. I have a good tongue in my head, and given enough time, I'm confident in my ability to persuade just about anyone of anything. But Elodin was simply too unpredictable to manipulate. You can't tell anyone she's here. It came out more forcefully than I'd intended, and I immediately regretted my choice of words. I was in no position to be giving orders to one of the masters, even if he was more than half mad. What I mean, I said quickly, is that I would take it as a great personal favor if you didn't mention her to anyone. Elodin gave me a long, speculative look. And why is that, Rilarkvoth? I felt myself break out into a sweat at the cool amusement in his tone. You'll stick her in Haven, I said. You of all people. I trailed off, my throat growing dry. Elodin stared down at me, his face little more than a shadow, but I could sense him scowling. Of all people, I what, Rilarkvoth? Do you presume to know my feelings toward Haven? I felt all my elegant, half-planned persuasion fall to tatters around my feet, and I suddenly felt like I was back on the streets of Tarbean. My stomach a hard knot of hunger, my chest full of desperate hopelessness, as I clutched at the sleeves of sailors and merchants, begging for pennies, half-pennies, shims, begging for anything so I could get something to eat. Please, I said to him. Please, Master Elodin. If they chase her, she'll hide, and I won't be able to find her. She isn't quite right in the head, but she's happy here, and I can take care of her. Not much, but a little. If they catch her, that would be even worse. Haven would kill her. Please, Master Elodin, I'll do whatever you like. Just don't tell anyone. Hush, Elodin said. She's coming. He reached out to grip my shoulder, and moonlight fell across his face. His expression wasn't fierce and hard at all. There was nothing but puzzlement and concern. Lord and lady, you're shaking. Take a breath and put your stage face on. You'll scare her if she sees you like this. I took a deep breath and fought to relax. Elodin's concerned expression faded, and he stepped back, letting go of my shoulder. I turned in time to see Ari scurry across the roof toward us, her arms full. She stopped a short distance away, eyeing us both, before coming the rest of the way, stepping carefully as a dancer, until she was back where she originally stood. Then she sat down lightly on the roof, crossing her legs beneath herself. Elodin and I sat as well, though not nearly as gracefully. Ari unfolded a cloth, lay it carefully between the three of us, then set a large, smooth wooden platter in the middle. She brought out the sinus fruit and sniffed it, her eyes peering over the top of it. What is in this? She asked Elodin. Sunshine, he said easily, as if he'd expected the question. And early morning sunshine at that. They knew each other. Of course. That was why she hadn't run away at the outset. I felt the solid bar of tension between my shoulder blades ease slightly. Ari sniffed the fruit again and looked thoughtful for a moment. It is lovely, she declared, but Kvoth's things are lovelier still. That stands to reason, Elodin said. I expect Kvoth is a nicer person than I am. That goes without saying, Ari said primly. Ari served up dinner, sharing out the bread and fish to each of us. She also produced a squat clay jar of brined olives. It made me glad to see she could provide for herself when I wasn't around. Ari poured beer into my familiar porcelain teacup. Elodin got a small glass jar of the sort you would use to store jam. She filled his cup for the first round, but not the second. I was left wondering if he was simply out of easy reach, or if it was a subtle sign of her displeasure. We ate without speaking, Ari delicately, taking tiny bites, her back straight. Elodin cautiously, occasionally darting a glance at me as if he were unsure how to behave. I guessed from this that he'd never shared a meal with Ari before. When we were finished with everything else, Ori brought out a small, bright knife and divided the sinus fruit into 3 parts. As soon as she broke the skin of it, I could smell it on the air, sweet and sharp. It made my mouth water. Sinus fruit came from a long way off and was simply too expensive for people like me. She held out my piece and I took it from her gently. Thank you kindly, Ori. You are welcome kindly, Kvothe. Elodin looked back and forth between the two of us. Ori? I waited for him to finish his question, but that seemed to be all of it. Ori understood before I did. It's my name, she said, grinning proudly. Is it now? Elodin said curiously. Ori nodded. Kvothe gave it to me. She beamed in my direction. Isn't it marvelous? Elodin nodded. It's a lovely name, he said politely. And it suits you. It does, she agreed. It is like having a flower in my heart. She gave Elodin a serious look. If your name is getting too heavy, you should have Kvothe give you a new one. Elodin nodded again and took a bite of his sinus. As he chewed, he turned to look at me. By the light of the moon, I saw his eyes. They were cool, thoughtful, and perfectly, utterly sane. After we finished our dinner, I sang a few songs, and we said our goodbyes. Elodin and I walked away together. I knew at least a half a dozen ways to climb down from the roof of Mainz, but I let him take the lead. We made our way past a round stone observatory that stuck up from the roof and moved on to a long stretch of reasonably flat lead sheeting. How long have you been coming to see her? Elodin asked. I thought about it. Half a year? It depends on when you start counting. It took a couple span of playing before I caught a glimpse of her. More before she trusted me enough to talk. You've had better luck than I have, he said. It's been years. This is the first time she's come within 10 paces of me. We barely speak a dozen words on a good day. We climbed over a wide, low chimney and back onto a gentle slope of thick timber sealed with layers of tar. As we walked, I grew more anxious. Why had he been trying to get close to her? I thought about the time I had gone to Haven with Elodin to visit his giller, Alder Wynn. I thought about Ori there. Tiny Ori, strapped to a bed with thick leather belts so she couldn't hurt herself or thrash around while she was being fed. I stopped walking. Elodin took a few more steps before turning to look at me. She's my friend, I said slowly. He nodded. That much is obvious. And I don't have enough friends that I could bear to lose one, I said. Not her. Promise me you won't tell anyone about her or bundle her off to Haven. It's not the right place for her. I swallowed against the dryness in my throat. I need you to promise me. Elodin tilted his head to one side. I'm hearing an or else, he said, amusement in his voice. Even though you're not actually saying it, I need to promise you or else. One corner of his mouth quirked up in a wry little smile. When he smiled, I felt a flash of anger mingled with anxiety and fear. It was followed by the sudden hot taste of plum and nutmeg in my mouth, and I became very conscious of the knife I had strapped to my thigh underneath my pants. I felt my hand slowly sliding into my pocket. Then, I saw the edge of the roof a half-dozen feet behind Elodin, and I felt my feet shift slightly, getting ready to sprint and tackle him, bearing us both off the roof and down to the hard cobblestones below. I felt a sudden, cold sweat sweep over my body and closed my eyes. I took a deep, slow breath, and the taste in my mouth faded. I opened my eyes again. I need you to promise me, I said, or else I'll probably do something stupid beyond all mortal ken. I swallowed. And both of us will end up the worse for it. Elodin looked at me. What a remarkably honest threat, he said. Normally they're much more growlish and gristly than that. Gristly? I asked, emphasizing the T. Don't you mean grizzly? Both, he said. Usually there's a lot of, I'll break your knees, I'll break your neck. He shrugged. Makes me think of gristle, like when you're boning a chicken. Ah, I said. I see. We stared at each other for a moment. I'm not going to send anyone to take her in, he said at last. Haven is the proper place for some folk. It's the only place for a lot of them. But I wouldn't wish a mad dog locked there if there were a better option. He turned and started to walk away. When I didn't follow, he turned to look back at me. That's not good enough, I said. I need you to promise. I swear on my mother's milk, Elodin said. I swear on my name and my power. I swear it by the ever-moving moon. We started walking again. She needs warmer clothes, I said, and socks and shoes, and a blanket, and they need to be new. Ari won't take anything that's been worn by anyone else. I've tried. She won't take them from me, Elodin said. I've left things out for her. She won't touch them. He turned to look at me. If I give them to you, will you pass them along? I nodded. In that case, she also needs about 20 talents, a ruby the size of an egg, and a new set of engraving tools. Elodin gave an honest, earthly chuckle. Does she also need lute strings? I nodded. 2 pair, if you can get them. Why Ari? Elodin asked. Because she doesn't have anyone else, I said. And neither do I. If we don't look out for each other, who will? He shook his head. No. Why did you pick that name for her? Ah, I said, embarrassed. Because she's so bright and sweet. She doesn't have any reason to be, but she is. Ari means sunny. In what language? He asked. I hesitated.
Ага, бежит. Катя, в тебя убит. Я ему 150 дал в полете, ебать. 3 FPS.
Я не верю, что чел тейкнул мой бат и из-за этого меня убьет.
Я помочь. Вот ХП.
Хорош. Я по кавере, можешь весить.
Крип FPS.
Пойдет у меня. В хате еще есть. Надо 10 работы добить, я нахуй.
Одно хп, Ктан.
Крак, тут круто.
В доме